Chapter 1. The Whispering Snowfall. It was a Christmas Eve unlike any other, the kind that seemed plucked from the pages of a fairy tale, where snow fell with the grace of whispered promises and the world itself appeared to hold its breath. Margaret, though she much preferred the more modern Maggie, wrapped her woolen scarf tighter against the cold and quickened her pace along the cobblestone street. The weight of solitude was heavier tonight, despite the holiday cheer glinting in every shop window. The village she had chosen for her solitary retreat, nestled deep in the English countryside, was famed for its Christmas charm. Twinkling lights adorned every tree, and the air carried the mingled scents of roasting chestnuts and mulled wine. Yet Maggie felt out of step with the revelry, her heart wrapped in the quiet ache of loneliness that the season so often amplified. She had no family to speak of, no lovers or close friends waiting for her back home in the city. This year, she had fled, not to escape Christmas itself, but to escape what it had become for her, a hollow echo of merriment she could not share. As she trudged past the edge of the village square, the festive warmth gave way to the solemn stillness of the countryside. The snow deepened, muffling her footsteps and transforming the world into an endless sea of white. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional sigh of wind through the skeletal trees. Maggie's breath puffed in visible clouds before her, and she paused to take in her surroundings. Here, away from the crowds and the carolers, the night felt both lonely and sacred, a blank canvas awaiting a story. She didn't know what drew her toward the old manor house. Perhaps it was the way its silhouette loomed against the snow-laden sky, a shadowed monolith steeped in mystery. It had stood empty for decades, the villagers said, abandoned by a family whose name had been lost to time. Local legends whispered of hauntings and secret treasures, though Maggie was skeptical of such tales. Still, something about the house called to her tonight, as though the snow itself was whispering her name and pointing her way. The gate, wrought iron and rusted with age, creaked ominously as she pushed it open. Maggie hesitated, her rational mind briefly battling with the strange, impulsive pull she felt. But the allure was too strong, the air too heavy with a sense of something just out of reach. She stepped through, the snow crunching beneath her boots as she approached the grand, ivy-clad facade. Its windows were dark, but the house seemed to watch her nonetheless, a sentinel of the past. The door was unlocked. Maggie blinked, surprised but not deterred. It opened with a groan of wood and hinges, and she stepped inside, her pulse quickening. The air within was cold and stale, tinged with the faint scent of decay. Yet there was an odd warmth, too, as if the house had been waiting for her. The first floor was a labyrinth of faded grandeur. Cracked marble floors, tarnished chandeliers, and walls lined with empty picture frames. She wandered through the halls, her footsteps echoing softly, until she found herself in a room dominated by a grand fireplace. Above it hung a mirror, its surface clouded with age. The reflection that stared back at her seemed almost unfamiliar, her modern attire a stark contrast to the antiquated elegance of her surroundings. Then she saw it. Nestled in the corner of the room, partially hidden beneath a sheet of dust-covered fabric, was a peculiar object. Maggie approached, her curiosity piqued. With a tentative hand, she pulled back the covering to reveal a small, ornate clock. Its face was encircled by intricate carvings of holly and ivy, and at its apex rested a tiny figure of an angel, its wings outstretched as if in flight. The hands of the clock were frozen at 11:59. A shiver ran down her spine. There was something impossibly compelling about the clock, as though it radiated an energy that defied logic. She reached out, her fingers grazing its cold, metallic surface. The instant she touched it, the room seemed to dissolve around her. The air shifted, growing warmer and more vibrant. A scent of fresh pine and candle wax replaced the mustiness, and the faint sound of distant music reached her ears. Maggie staggered, disoriented, and clutched the mantel for support. When she looked up, the mirror above the fireplace was no longer clouded. Instead, it reflected a scene so vivid and strange that she could scarcely believe her eyes. The room was alive, illuminated by the glow of countless candles. A Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, its boughs adorned with delicate ornaments. And there, in the reflection, she saw them. People dressed in Victorian attire, their laughter and chatter filling the air with life. Turning slowly, Maggie found herself no longer alone. The room around her had transformed, and the strangers in the mirror now stood before her, their eyes widening in surprise and curiosity. Her heart raced as she took a step back, the weight of this impossible reality crashing over her. She wasn't just looking into the past, she was in it. And then, amidst the crowd of unfamiliar faces, her gaze locked onto his. A young man, standing apart from the others, his dark hair slightly disheveled and his eyes alight with something she could only describe as wonder. He held a sketch pad in his hand, a pencil tucked behind his ear. Though he did not speak, his presence filled the room as surely as the light of the candles. The clock struck 12. A single chime, resonant and clear, echoed through the room. The world seemed to hold its breath, and Maggie felt the pull of something she couldn't yet name but knew she could not resist. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She had stepped into the story, and there was no turning back. Chapter 2. The Hidden Door of December. Maggie stood frozen, caught between the intoxicating allure of the unfamiliar world around her and the gnawing edge of disbelief. Her breath quickened, the soft lace of her scarf fluttering as if in protest to the weight of this strange reality. Every detail was sharper now, more vibrant than the muted shades of the world she'd left behind. The flickering glow of candlelight cast golden halos on the walls, while the scent of evergreen mingled with the faint aroma of mulled wine. This wasn't a dream. It was a world impossibly alive. The young man, the artist, seemed as captivated by her as she was by him. His gaze lingered, tracing the unfamiliar contours of her modern coat and boots. Maggie could feel the hum of curiosity in the air, but it was his eyes, a stormy shade of gray, shadowed with depth and secrets, that rooted her in place. He took a step closer, sketchpad clutched tightly against his chest, as though he feared she might vanish if he blinked too long. "You." A voice broke through the haze, soft and melodic. Maggie's eyes darted toward a woman in an elegant crimson gown, her dark curls arranged in an intricate coiffure. The woman's lips parted again as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she looked to the artist, whose name Maggie still didn't know, as if silently urging him to lead. But no one moved. The room seemed suspended in that perfect, fleeting moment of uncertainty, a fragile balance between fear and wonder. Finally, Maggie's instinct jolted her into action. She took a hesitant step backward, her boot heel scraping against the polished floor. The sound shattered the delicate spell, and whispers rippled through the gathered crowd like wind rustling through leaves. She turned toward the doorway she had entered through, but instead of the dim, decayed hallway she had left behind, she was met with an opulent corridor adorned with garlands and wreaths. The house had shifted, reshaping itself as if to seal her fate. She needed answers, not from the bewildered guests, whose expressions were a mirror of her own confusion, but from the source of this strangeness. The clock, the peculiar, ornate clock she had touched just moments ago. It must still be in the room, even amidst this transformed setting. Her gaze darted around, searching. There it was, perched on a pedestal near the fireplace. Its intricate carvings glinted in the firelight, but now its hands had moved. 11:59 was no longer frozen in time. They now ticked steadily forward, the faint sound audible beneath the murmurs of the crowd. Her pulse quickened. The clock was a thread, unraveling the boundary between her world and this one. If she could understand it, she could perhaps find her way back. As she stepped toward it, the artist moved with surprising swiftness to intercept her. His hand, slender but strong, caught her wrist just as she reached for the clock. The sudden contact sent a jolt through her, like static electricity snapping in a winter storm. For the first time, he spoke. "Don't," he said, his voice low but firm, as though commanding both her and the very air around them. His accent was rich, the cadence of his words tinged with a gentility that belonged to another era. Maggie's lips parted to respond, but her voice betrayed her. She could only stare at him, at the way the firelight played on the angles of his face and illuminated the faint smudge of charcoal on his cheek. There was urgency in his eyes, a plea she could not yet understand. The spell of his command was broken by the soft chime of the clock. Midnight. The sound rippled through the room, its resonance deeper and more foreboding than any ordinary clock should possess. The guests stirred uneasily, their whispers growing louder, until they began to drift away, one by one, through doors Maggie hadn't noticed before. Within moments, the grand room was nearly empty, save for the artist and the woman in crimson, who lingered by the far wall, her gaze sharp and calculating. "You shouldn't be here," the artist said, releasing her wrist but not stepping back. "You've disrupted something that cannot be undone." Maggie found her voice at last. "I don't even know where here is." He hesitated, as if weighing how much he should tell her. "This house exists between moments," he said finally. "It is a door, but only for those who can find it. And I found it by accident?" she asked, the tremor in her voice betraying her rising panic. He shook his head. "There are no accidents here. The clock chose you." Her gaze flicked back to the clock, which now glowed faintly, as though lit from within. The angel at its apex seemed to watch her, its tiny wings poised as if ready to carry her away. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The artist didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was an ornament, delicately crafted from glass and silver, shaped like a snowflake. He held it out to her, his expression softening. "Take this. It will guide you." Maggie hesitated but accepted the ornament, its cool surface sending another shiver through her. "What am I supposed to do with it?" "When the time comes, you'll know," he said, his voice tinged with both hope and sadness. The crimson-clad woman stepped forward then, her presence commanding attention. "She has much to learn before that time comes," she said, her tone rich with authority. "We must prepare her." Maggie's heart sank. Prepare her for what? She wanted to ask, but the words lodged in her throat. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of her predicament settling heavily on her shoulders. She clutched the ornament tightly, its intricate patterns pressing into her palm. Whatever lay ahead, she was certain of one thing. The door she had opened was no ordinary door, and her journey had only just begun. Chapter 3. A world painted in shadows. The night pressed heavily against the manor, a dark shroud that seemed to blur the edges of reality itself. Maggie clutched the delicate snowflake ornament in her palm, its intricate surface cool against her skin. It felt both fragile and unyielding, as though it carried the weight of something vast and unknowable. The artist's words echoed in her mind. "The clock chose you." What could that possibly mean? The crimson-clad woman moved with a grace that was almost unnerving, her gown swishing softly against the polished floor as she approached the fireplace. The fire burned lower now, its embers casting flickering shadows on the walls. She gestured toward an ornate armchair. "Sit," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to being refused. Maggie hesitated, her gaze darting between the woman and the artist. His expression had softened, but there was still a guarded tension in his posture. He stood near the mantel, his sketchpad now tucked under one arm, as if he were both a witness and a participant in whatever was about to unfold. Reluctantly, Maggie sank into the chair, its cushions surprisingly soft despite their aged appearance. The snowflake ornament remained in her hand, a talisman she could not bring herself to release. "You've crossed a threshold few ever see," the woman began, her dark eyes fixed on Maggie. "This house exists beyond the bounds of ordinary time, a sanctuary for moments that refuse to be forgotten. But such crossings are not without consequence." "I didn't mean to cross anything," Maggie said, her voice trembling. I found the clock. It was an accident." The woman's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "There are no accidents," she replied, echoing the artist's earlier words. "The clock is a bridge, a beacon for those who are searching, whether they realize it or not." "Tell me, Maggie, what were you seeking?" Maggie blinked, startled by the question. "I wasn't looking for anything," she said quickly, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. The truth was harder to admit, even to herself. She had been seeking something, a sense of belonging, a spark of magic in a life that had grown dull and predictable. But how could she explain that to this woman, whose piercing gaze seemed to see through her every defense? The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Finally, the artist broke it, his voice soft but firm. "The house responds to longing," he said. "It finds those who carry it in their hearts, even if they cannot name it." Maggie's fingers tightened around the ornament. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's smile widened, though it did little to comfort her. "Now, you learn the rules of this place," she said, "and you begin to understand the part you are meant to play." Before Maggie could respond, the woman moved to the far wall and pressed her hand against one of the carved wooden panels. A faint click echoed through the room, and a hidden door swung open, revealing a narrow passageway lit by the dim glow of oil lamps. The woman stepped aside, gesturing for Maggie to follow. Maggie rose slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The artist moved to her side, offering a reassuring nod. "You're not alone in this," he said, "but you must see what lies beyond." The passage was colder than the main room, the air heavy with the scent of damp stone and aged wood. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crowded with objects that seemed plucked from different eras. A tarnished pocket watch, a porcelain doll with cracked cheeks, a leather-bound book whose spine was embossed with gilded lettering Maggie couldn't decipher. Each item seemed to hum with a faint, otherworldly energy, as though they carried the echoes of the lives they had once touched. "These are relics of the house," the woman explained as they walked. "Fragments of the moments it preserves. Every object holds a story, and every story is bound to the magic of this place." Maggie's gaze lingered on a silver locket, its surface etched with delicate vines. She reached out, but the woman's voice stopped her. "Not yet," she said sharply. "You must understand your own story before you can touch another." At the end of the passage, they emerged into a circular chamber. The walls were painted with a mural that depicted scenes from what seemed to be different eras. A medieval banquet, a Victorian Christmas feast, a bustling 1920s parlor. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it rested another clock, identical to the one Maggie had found in the abandoned room. Its hands, too, were frozen at 11:59. The artist stepped forward, his expression solemn. "This is the heart of the house," he said, "the clock that binds its magic. Your arrival has set something in motion, Maggie. The hands will move again, but only if you make the right choices." "What choices?" Maggie asked, her voice rising with frustration. I don't understand any of this. The woman placed a hand on her shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. You will, she said. In time. The words did little to calm Maggie's racing thoughts, but she nodded nonetheless. The snowflake ornament felt heavier now, its weight a constant reminder of the path she had unwittingly chosen. As she stared at the frozen hands of the clock, she couldn't shake the feeling that her own time was running out. Chapter 4. The Brushstroke of Fate. The days within the house stretched like threads in a tapestry, woven by a hand unseen. Maggie could not say how long she had been there. Time seemed to bend and twist, flowing in peculiar ways. Every moment was suspended, the air thick with the hum of possibility. The snowflake ornament remained a constant weight in her pocket, its presence both reassuring and enigmatic. She found herself unconsciously tracing its edges, her fingers following the delicate filigree as if seeking answers it might reveal. The artist, she had learned his name was Elias, was her guide through the house's many mysteries. Together, they traversed winding corridors that seemed to multiply and shift, leading to rooms that defied logic. Some were grand and opulent, their walls adorned with gilded mirrors and velvet drapes. Others were small and sparse, filled with forgotten relics that whispered secrets of the past. Maggie found herself drawn to these quieter spaces, where the weight of history felt most tangible. Elias seemed to understand her unspoken questions, though he offered few answers. He spoke in riddles, his words veiled in poetry that hinted at truths just beyond her grasp. It was as if he carried the house's magic within him, his very presence an extension of its enigmatic power. Yet there was a warmth to him, a quiet kindness that steadied her when the strangeness of her surroundings threatened to overwhelm. It was on one such day, as they walked through a long gallery lined with painted portraits, that Maggie felt the first stirrings of something deeper. The gallery was cold, its air tinged with the faint scent of turpentine and dust. The paintings, though masterfully rendered, were unsettling. Each depicted a moment frozen in time. A family gathered around a Christmas tree, their faces shadowed by melancholy. A child clutching a toy soldier, his expression caught between joy and fear. A woman in a crimson gown, her gaze fixed on a distant horizon as if searching for something lost. These are echoes, Elias said, his voice low. He stopped beside a portrait of a man seated at a writing desk, his quill poised above a blank page. Fragments of lives intertwined with the house. Some are preserved by choice, others by necessity. Maggie studied the portrait, her brow furrowing. The man's eyes were intense, his expression caught in a moment of hesitation. She wondered what story he had been trying to write, and why he had never begun. "What about you?" she asked, turning to Elias. "Are you an echo too?" He met her gaze, his storm-gray eyes unreadable. "Perhaps," he said softly, "or perhaps I am merely a guide, like the clock itself." The mention of the clock sent a shiver through her. Since that first night, its image had haunted her dreams, its frozen hands a symbol of everything she did not understand. She had not seen it again, but she felt its presence everywhere, as if the house's magic revolved around it. "I need to know more," she said, her voice firm. "About the clock, about why I'm here. None of this feels real, but it's too vivid to be a dream." Elias's expression softened, a flicker of something like regret passing over his face. "The answers you seek lie beneath the clock," he said. "But to reach them, you must first face the echoes of your own heart." Before she could ask what he meant, he gestured for her to follow. They continued down the gallery, the paintings watching silently as they passed. At the far end, they descended a spiral staircase that seemed to wind endlessly downward, its steps worn smooth by countless footsteps. The air grew cooler, the faint scent of damp stone mingling with something sweeter, like old parchment. At last, they emerged into a cavernous chamber. The walls were rough-hewn stone, illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns that hung from iron brackets. In the center of the room stood the clock, its ornate frame gleaming in the dim light. Maggie's breath caught. It was identical to the one she had found in the abandoned room, but this time, its hands were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they inched toward midnight. "This is the heart of the house," Elias said, his voice reverent. "Every story, every moment, is drawn to this point. The clock binds them all together." Maggie stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the intricate carvings that adorned its surface. She saw angels and stars, swirling patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. At its center, the hands moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic. "What happens when it strikes midnight?" she asked. Elias hesitated. "That depends on you," he said. "Midnight is a threshold, a point of transformation. For some, it is an end. For others, a beginning." The words sent a chill through her. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the snowflake ornament. It seemed to hum softly, as if in response to the clock's presence. "And this?" she asked, holding it up. "It is your key," Elias said. "A fragment of the house's magic, tied to your story. But its purpose will only reveal itself when the time is right." Maggie frowned, frustration bubbling beneath her confusion. "Why can't anyone just give me a straight answer?" Elias's lips curved into a faint smile. "Because the answers are not ours to give. They are yours to discover." She turned back to the clock, its steady ticking filling the chamber. The hands were closer to midnight now, the distance between them and the threshold narrowing with every passing moment. Maggie's heart pounded, a sense of urgency building within her. Whatever lay beyond this moment, she knew she was running out of time. Chapter 5, Laced in Frost and Secrets. The air in the chamber beneath the clock was dense, heavy with an energy that seemed alive. Maggie stood frozen, her eyes locked on the clock's gilded hands as they crept ever closer to midnight. The soft ticking filled her ears, a sound that seemed to reverberate deep within her chest. The snowflake ornament pulsed faintly in her palm, its icy surface warming with each beat of her heart. Elias lingered at the edge of the room, his expression unreadable. He seemed content to let Maggie absorb the moment, his silence an unspoken invitation for her to ask the questions swirling in her mind. But Maggie remained quiet, overwhelmed by the weight of what she was witnessing. How had her life led to this strange, impossible place where time itself was a living force? Her gaze fell on the base of the clock, where intricate carvings depicted scenes from lives long past. She knelt to examine them more closely, tracing her fingers over the delicate engravings. There were images of joyous celebrations and quiet sorrow, of love and loss and fleeting moments of wonder. One carving in particular caught her eye, a young woman holding a snowflake ornament, her face turned toward a shadowy figure in the distance. The scene was hauntingly familiar, and Maggie's breath hitched. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias stepped forward, his footsteps soft against the stone floor. "She could be anyone," he said, "or she could be you." The carvings reflect the stories woven into the house, but their meanings are not fixed. They shift, shaped by those who see them. Maggie frowned, her fingers lingering on the snowflake in the carving. "Why does it feel like this has all happened before?" Elias tilted his head, considering her question. "Perhaps it has," he said. "Time is not a straight line. It loops and folds, connecting moments in ways we cannot always understand. The house exists within those folds, a nexus of stories that are both separate and intertwined." Maggie stood, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You keep speaking in riddles," she said, her voice rising. "I need real answers. What am I supposed to do? What happens when the clock strikes midnight? Elias's expression softened, and for the first time, Maggie saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. Midnight is a turning point, he said, a moment of choice. The clock's magic will reveal a path, but it is up to you to decide whether to follow it. And if I don't, then the house will release you, Elias said. You will return to your own time, unchanged. But the stories you have touched here will remain incomplete, their threads left to fray. Maggie's grip on the ornament tightened. She felt torn between the desire to escape this bewildering place and the inexplicable pull to stay. The house seemed to hum with anticipation, as if it too were waiting for her decision. "What about you?" she asked suddenly. "What happens to you if I leave?" Elias hesitated, his gaze drifting to the clock. "I am bound to the house," he said quietly. "My story is its story. I cannot leave, no matter what you choose." The sadness in his voice struck a chord in Maggie. She thought of the portrait gallery, of the countless lives preserved within the house's walls. Was Elias just another echo, a fragment of a story caught in time? Or was he something more? The clock's ticking grew louder, each second reverberating like a drumbeat. Maggie's heart raced as the hands edged closer to midnight. She felt a strange energy building in the room, a force that seemed to draw her toward the clock. The snowflake ornament grew warm in her hand, its light intensifying until it cast a soft glow that illuminated the chamber. Elias stepped back, giving her space. "It is time," he said. "The clock awaits your choice." Maggie took a deep breath, her mind racing. What lay on the other side of this moment? Would she find answers, or only more questions? Her gaze fell on the snowflake ornament, its intricate design shimmering with an inner light. It felt like a key, a bridge between worlds. But did she dare to use it? The clock's hands reached midnight, and the chamber was filled with a soft chime that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. The air shimmered, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to dissolve into a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. Maggie felt a pull, as if the house itself were urging her forward. She stepped closer to the clock, her hand trembling as she raised the ornament. The light from its surface intertwined with the clock's glow, creating a cascade of colors that danced across the walls. Maggie closed her eyes, her heart pounding as she whispered a silent prayer. Then, with a surge of courage, she placed the ornament into a small recess at the center of the clock. The room fell silent. The clock's ticking stopped, and the air grew still. Maggie opened her eyes, bracing herself for what might come. The snowflake ornament began to spin, its light growing brighter until it enveloped her completely. She felt weightless, as if she were being carried on a current of time itself. When the light faded, Maggie found herself standing in a new room. It was smaller than the chamber beneath the clock, its walls lined with shelves filled with books and trinkets. A single window overlooked a snow-covered landscape, the moonlight casting a silvery glow. In the center of the room stood a figure, their back turned to her. "Welcome," the figure said, their voice warm and familiar. They turned, and Maggie's breath caught. It was Elias, but different. Younger, more vibrant. His eyes filled with a light she had not seen before. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Elias smiled. "We are in the past," he said. "Your journey is just beginning." Chapter 6. The Echo of Candlelight. The past enveloped Maggie like a cold embrace, the air crisp and sharp against her skin. She stood in the small, book-lined room where she had arrived, the snowflake ornament still faintly glowing in her hand. The quiet was profound, broken only by the distant sound of a clock striking the hour somewhere beyond the walls. Elias, younger and yet achingly familiar, waited by the window, his posture poised but contemplative. The sight of him stirred a wave of questions in Maggie's mind, but she held them back, unsure of how to begin. You feel it, don't you? Elias said, his voice softer than she remembered, but no less enigmatic. He did not turn from the window, his gaze fixed on the snowy expanse outside. The weight of the time you've crossed. Maggie stepped forward, her boots crunching lightly against the wooden floor. The room's warmth barely staved off the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. "Where are we?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions within her. Elias glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile playing on his lips. "A place where your story and mine first began," he said, "or perhaps where they begin anew. Time is never as straightforward as we wish it to be." Maggie felt a flicker of frustration. "You keep speaking in riddles," she said. "If I'm to make sense of any of this, I need something real, something solid." Elias turned fully to face her, and for the first time, she saw a vulnerability in his expression that she hadn't noticed before. "I know," he said softly, "and I promise there is clarity to be found. But not all truths come easily, Maggie. Sometimes they must be uncovered piece by piece, like uncovering footprints buried beneath fresh snow." His words lingered in the air as he gestured for her to follow. Together, they left the room, stepping into a narrow corridor lit by the flickering glow of gas lamps. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries, their colors muted by time. Maggie's footsteps echoed faintly as they walked, the sound mingling with the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath them. As they moved deeper into the house, Maggie noticed subtle changes. The air grew colder, and the light from the gas lamps seemed dimmer, casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. There was an eerie beauty to the place, as if it existed on the edge of a dream. And yet, something about it felt familiar, as if she had walked these halls before. "Do you recognize it?" Elias asked, glancing at her. Maggie hesitated. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "It feels like a memory I can't quite grasp." Elias nodded, as if her answer confirmed something for him. "This house holds echoes of many lives," he said. "Some of those echoes have touched you before, even if you don't yet remember how." They reached a grand staircase that spiraled downward, its banister polished to a sheen that reflected the dim light. As they descended, Maggie's unease grew. The house seemed alive, its silence broken by faint, almost imperceptible whispers that prickled at the edge of her hearing. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the steady presence of Elias ahead of her. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a vast hall. Its high ceiling was adorned with intricate woodwork, and tall windows lined one side, their panes frosted over with ice. A large fireplace dominated one wall, its embers glowing faintly. The room was empty, save for a single easel set near the center. A canvas rested on it, partially obscured by a white cloth. Elias approached the easel, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not remove the cloth, but instead stood beside it, his gaze fixed on Maggie. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Maggie shook her head, her curiosity mingling with apprehension. "Should I?" "Not yet," Elias said, "but it is part of your story, and part of mine. Would you like to see it?" Maggie hesitated, her instincts warning her that whatever lay beneath the cloth would change everything. But the pull of the unknown was too strong to resist. She nodded, stepping closer as Elias reached for the cloth. He pulled it away with a single, fluid motion, revealing a painting that took Maggie's breath away. It depicted a snowy landscape, eerily similar to the one she had seen through the window. In the foreground stood a woman in a crimson cloak, her back turned as she gazed toward a distant figure, a man, standing beneath the boughs of a snow-laden tree. The details were exquisite, from the delicate embroidery on the woman's cloak to the faint trail of footprints in the snow. But what struck Maggie most was the familiarity of the scene. She recognized the woman. It was her. and the man beneath the tree was Elias. "How?" she began, her voice trembling. Elias's expression was solemn. "The house remembers," he said. "It weaves together the threads of time, preserving moments that are meant to endure. This painting is one such thread, a fragment of a story that has yet to be completed." Maggie stepped closer to the painting, her fingers hovering just above its surface. The snowflake ornament in her hand grew warm again, its light faint but steady. She felt a strange connection to the painting, as if it were more than an image, as if it were a doorway. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, turning to Elias. His gaze was steady. "Follow the footsteps," he said. "Find the tree. The answers you seek lie there." Before Maggie could respond, the room seemed to shift around her. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, and the light from the fireplace dimmed. She felt the pull of the snowflake ornament urging her toward the painting. And then, as if the canvas itself had come alive, she was drawn into its depths, the world around her dissolving into a swirl of snow and light. When the sensation passed, Maggie found herself standing in the very landscape depicted in the painting. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and the air was filled with the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees. Ahead of her, the crimson cloak she wore billowed softly in the breeze. And in the distance, beneath the branches of the snow-laden tree, stood Elias, waiting. Chapter 7. Where Time Stands Still. The snow fell in soft, silvery flakes, each one landing with a delicate kiss on Maggie's cloak. The landscape was pristine and untouched, a world carved in ice and moonlight. The tree stood tall and ancient in the distance, its branches heavy with snow. Beneath it, Elias waited, his figure still as if sculpted from the very winter itself. Maggie's breath puffed into the cold air as she stepped forward. Her boots sank into the snow, each step leaving a crisp imprint that seemed to echo through the quiet expanse. The ornament in her hand glowed faintly, its warmth steadying her as she moved closer to the tree and the man who had become a strange and constant thread in the unraveling tapestry of her journey. As she approached, she noticed the way Elias's eyes followed her, their depth piercing yet inviting. He did not speak immediately, as if waiting for her to find her own words. Maggie's heart raced, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of significance that seemed to hang in the air between them. "I'm here," she said at last, her voice soft but clear. Elias inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. "And the journey has brought you far," he replied. His voice was calm, resonant, a sound that felt both familiar and foreign. "Do you feel it yet?" Maggie tilted her head, uncertain. "Feel what?" Elias gestured to the landscape around them. The snow, the trees, the stars that seemed brighter here than they had ever been in her world. "The weight of time," he said. "This place is more than a moment. It is an intersection, a meeting point for what has been and what will be. Do you see?" Maggie looked around, trying to grasp the meaning in his words. The air itself seemed to hum with something unseen, a quiet, thrumming energy that she couldn't quite name. She closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her. And then she felt it. Not a physical presence, but an awareness, a connection to the past and the future, as if the world around her were breathing in rhythm with her own heart. "I think I do," she said, opening her eyes. "But it's overwhelming." Elias smiled faintly, a hint of warmth breaking through his stoic demeanor. "It always is at first," he said, "but you're stronger than you realize. You've already begun to unravel the threads." Maggie frowned, her gaze drifting to the tree. "You keep talking about threads," she said. "What does it mean? What is it I'm supposed to be doing?" Elias stepped closer, his boots crunching softly in the snow. He reached out, his hand hovering near the ornament in Maggie's grasp, but not touching it. "This," he said, is more than an object. It is a bridge, a way to connect two distant hearts. But it is also a guide, a compass for your soul. The answers you seek lie within it, and within yourself. Maggie's grip tightened on the ornament. And you? Where do you fit into all of this? Elias's expression grew somber. I am a thread, like you, he said, bound to this place and to its story. But my path is tied to yours. We are not meant to walk these roads alone, Maggie. That is one of the truths this journey will reveal. Maggie's heart ached at the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the strange bond that had formed between them. But the uncertainty of it all pressed down on her like the snow-laden branches above. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't even know what this is. Elias's gaze softened. You are stronger than you think, he said. And you are not alone. He turned toward the tree, his hand brushing against its bark. A sudden gust of wind swirled around them, scattering snowflakes in a glittering whirlwind. The tree seemed to pulse with light, its branches shimmering as if dusted with starlight. Maggie stared in awe as the glow intensified, revealing carvings etched into the bark, scenes of lives long past, stories woven into the fabric of time. One carving caught her eye. It depicted a woman standing beneath the very tree they now stood under. Her hand extended toward a man who knelt before her, offering a small, glowing object. The figures were rough yet unmistakable, their features mirroring Maggie and Elias with uncanny accuracy. What is this? Maggie asked, her voice barely a whisper. A moment that has yet to come, Elias said, or perhaps one that has already been. Time is not a line, Maggie. It is a tapestry, with threads that overlap and intertwine. This moment is part of our story, a choice waiting to be made. Maggie reached out, her fingers brushing against the carving. The ornament in her hand pulsed in response, its light merging with the glow of the tree. A surge of energy coursed through her, a sensation both exhilarating and terrifying. What happens if I choose wrong? She asked, turning to Elias. He met her gaze, his eyes steady. There is no wrong choice, he said, only different paths. But whichever you choose, know that it will lead you closer to the truth. Maggie's mind raced, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She looked at the carving, at the snowflake ornament glowing in her hand, and at Elias, whose presence felt like both a challenge and a comfort. The snow fell around them in a hushed, rhythmic dance, as if the world itself were holding its breath. With a deep breath, Maggie made her choice. She placed the snowflake ornament against the carving, its light merging fully with the tree. A burst of energy erupted around them, and the world shifted once more, the snow and the tree dissolving into a cascade of light and shadow. When the light faded, Maggie found herself standing in a new place, the air warmer and filled with the sound of laughter and music. She turned to see Elias beside her, his expression unreadable but tinged with a faint smile. Welcome, he said, to the next chapter of our story. Chapter 8, The Artist's Silent Plea. The warmth of the new place enveloped Maggie, a stark contrast to the biting cold she had just left behind. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across the room, illuminating a scene of festive revelry. Garlands of holly and ivy adorned the walls, while a grand fir tree stood in the corner, its branches heavy with handmade ornaments and ribbons. Laughter and music filled the air. A lively tune played on a fiddle weaving through the hum of voices. Maggie stood at the edge of the scene, her heart racing as she took in the unfamiliar yet comforting surroundings. She had expected disorientation, perhaps even fear, but what she felt instead was a strange sense of belonging, as if she had stepped into a memory that wasn't entirely her own. Elias was beside her, his presence steadying. He, too, seemed taken by the scene. his gaze sweeping across the room with a mix of curiosity and something deeper, an emotion Maggie couldn't quite place. He turned to her, his expression softening. "Do you know where we are?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Maggie shook her head. "It feels familiar," she admitted, "but I don't recognize it." Elias nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had suspected. "This is a place of significance," he said, "not just to you, but to the threads we're unraveling. Look closer, Maggie. The clues are here." She glanced around, her eyes lingering on the people gathered by the hearth. Families and friends sat close together, their faces lit with joy as they exchanged gifts and stories. A woman in a velvet gown knelt by a child, helping him tie a ribbon around a carefully wrapped present. An older man with a beard like frost laughed heartily, raising a glass of mulled wine in a toast. The scene was idyllic, a snapshot of warmth and connection. And yet, there was something else, something beneath the surface. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that the room held secrets, whispers hidden in the flicker of the flames and the shadows that danced on the walls. She turned her attention to the fireplace, its flames crackling merrily. Above the mantel hung a garland intertwined with silver bells, their soft chime barely audible over the music. "The hearth," Elias said, following her gaze. "It's more than it seems." Maggie stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. As she approached the fireplace, the warmth intensified, wrapping around her like a tangible presence. She felt the ornament in her hand pulse faintly, its glow echoing the light of the flames. The whispers grew louder, not in her ears but in her mind, fragments of words and phrases she couldn't fully grasp. "What is it?" she asked, glancing at Elias. "A place where stories converge," he said. "Every fire has its embers, and every ember has its tale. This hearth has seen many lives, many moments. If you listen closely, it will show you what you need to see." Maggie hesitated, unsure of how to listen to a fireplace. But the ornament in her hand seemed to know, its glow intensifying as she drew closer. She knelt before the hearth, the warmth of the flames kissing her face. Closing her eyes, she let the whispers wash over her, focusing on their rhythm and cadence. Images began to form in her mind, faint at first but growing clearer with each passing moment. She saw a young woman seated by the hearth, her hands clasped tightly around a book. The woman's face was drawn with worry, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone. Maggie felt her fear, her longing, as if they were her own. Then the scene shifted. The same woman stood by the fireplace, her face lit with hope as a man entered the room. He was thin and pale, his clothes worn but his smile radiant. He held a small, wrapped box in his hands, which he offered to the woman. She accepted it with trembling fingers, her joy palpable. Maggie opened her eyes, the vision fading but the emotions lingering. She turned to Elias, who watched her with quiet intensity. "I saw her," Maggie said, "the woman by the hearth. She was waiting for someone, and he came. He brought her a gift." Elias nodded. "Their story is part of this place," he said, "but it's also connected to yours." The gift he gave her was no ordinary present. It was something crafted with love, imbued with meaning. "Do you understand what that means?" Maggie looked down at the ornament in her hand, its light now steady and bright. "It's the same," she murmured. "The ornament. It's part of this." Elias's expression softened, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Exactly," he said. "This hearth has seen its share of magic, Maggie. It's a place where love and time intertwine, where gifts become bridges and moments become eternal." Before Maggie could respond, the room seemed to shift again. The laughter and music faded, the warmth of the hearth giving way to a chill that crept through the air. The people in the room blurred, their forms dissolving into shadows. Only the tree, the fireplace, and the faint glow of the ornament remained. "What's happening?" Maggie asked, panic rising in her chest. Elias placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "The hearth has shown you what it can," he said. "Now it's time to take the next step. Trust the ornament, Maggie. It will guide you." Maggie tightened her grip on the ornament, its warmth grounding her as the world around her continued to dissolve. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever came next. The whispers grew louder, a crescendo of voices that seemed to speak directly to her heart. And then, with a final surge of light, the world shifted once more. When Maggie opened her eyes, she found herself standing in a new place, the air heavy with the scent of pine and snow. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to hum with possibility. Beside her, Elias stood tall, his gaze steady. "The hearth has brought us closer to the truth," he said, "but the path ahead is still unwritten. Are you ready?" Maggie took a deep breath, the ornament glowing softly in her hand. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I'm ready." Chapter 9. Between the canvas and the clock. Evelyn awoke to the soft golden light of a wintry morning filtering through the curtains, casting delicate patterns on the walls of the small, dimly lit room. The wind outside was still, a faint chill carrying the promise of snow, but inside the humble cottage, it felt as if time had slowed to a peaceful halt. She lay there for a moment, her thoughts a swirl of memories and emotions, before reality settled around her once more. Her hand instinctively reached for the velvet box on the bedside table, where the magical ornament rested. The same ornament that had brought her to this time, to this world, and, most importantly, to a man who had captured her heart in a way no one else had. She had come to love him, the artist who was struggling not only against the harshness of the Victorian world, but also against his own doubts about his worth. She turned the ornament over in her hand, the weight of it comforting. Its polished surface gleamed softly in the morning light, reflecting fragments of her face, of his face, of the lives they had shared in this fleeting moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something beyond just their connection across time. The ornament, though a beautiful memento of their journey together, was more than that. It was a symbol of a promise they both had made, a promise neither had yet spoken aloud. Evelyn sat up, a quiet sigh escaping her lips as she looked around the room. The cottage was small, but it held a certain warmth, a kind of tranquility that soothed her. The air smelled faintly of pine and firewood, a reminder of the holiday season. It had been weeks since she had first arrived, and every moment had felt like a dream she had been terrified of waking from. The soft crackle of the hearth in the corner brought her back to the present. Thomas, the artist, had been up early, as usual, working by the fire with his brushes and canvases scattered around him. There was a certain grace to the way he moved, even in the simplest of tasks. He worked tirelessly, his passion evident in every stroke, but Evelyn could see the weariness in his eyes. She knew that beneath his quiet demeanor, he was still haunted by the doubts of his talent, still burdened by the knowledge that he might never be able to share his art with the world in the way he deserved. Evelyn rose from the bed and walked to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. The world was still, serene in its wintry beauty, and yet, inside her, there was a storm of emotions brewing. She loved him, there was no doubt about that, but the complexities of their situation weighed heavily on her heart. Every time she looked at him, she was reminded of the fleeting nature of their time together. She couldn't stay here forever. She couldn't live in this world of dreams while her own reality awaited her back in the future. And yet, the thought of leaving him was unbearable. Would he even remember her when she was gone? Would the magic of the ornament be enough to keep their connection alive across time? Evelyn? The soft sound of her name brought her out of her reverie. She turned to see Thomas standing in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Good morning," she said, offering him a smile that she hoped masked the turmoil inside. He walked toward her, his footsteps light on the wooden floor. "You've been quiet this morning," he remarked, his eyes searching hers. "Something on your mind?" Evelyn hesitated, her gaze flickering back to the ornament. She wanted to tell him everything, about the future she was from, about the time they were caught in, about the unspoken promise they had made to each other. But the words felt too heavy, too painful to speak aloud. "It's nothing," she said softly, turning away from him to look back out the window. "Just thinking." He didn't press her. Instead, he reached out and gently touched her shoulder. The warmth of his hand seeped through the fabric of her dress, sending a shiver down her spine. "I know you're troubled, Evelyn, but whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." His words hit her like a wave, and she swallowed hard against the knot in her throat. How could she tell him the truth? How could she explain that the life she had built here, with him, was destined to end, and she had no idea how to bring herself to say goodbye? But Thomas seemed to sense the struggle within her. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know this. What we have right now is real. And no matter where we go from here, I'll always carry this with me." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time since her arrival in this time, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps there was more to their connection than just a fleeting moment, a connection that could transcend time, a love that could withstand the distance between their worlds. Perhaps there was a way to make their promise to each other last. "You truly believe that?" she asked, turning to face him, her eyes searching his for any sign of doubt. "I do," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "I may not understand how or why, but I believe in us." Her heart swelled with emotion, and for a moment, all the uncertainties of their situation melted away. They stood there in the soft glow of the morning light, the unspoken promise between them growing stronger with every passing moment. But as the day stretched on and the snow began to fall gently outside, Evelyn knew that the time would come when they would have to face the truth of the ornament, the truth of their worlds, and the truth of their love. And when that time came, they would have to decide whether their bond was strong enough to defy the very fabric of time itself. For now, though, they would hold on to each other, living in the moment, savoring the warmth of their connection while it lasted. And in the quiet moments that followed, as they sat by the fire and shared stories, Evelyn allowed herself to believe, if only for a little while, that perhaps love could transcend the barriers of time. Chapter 10. A Christmas Kiss Forgotten by Time. The snow fell gently outside the cottage, its powdery white blanket weaving an unbroken tapestry over the landscape. It was a quiet day, the world outside muffled beneath the weight of winter's touch. Inside, the warmth of the hearth crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the room where Evelyn sat by the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames. Her thoughts were restless. For weeks now, she had tried to ignore the gnawing sensation at the back of her mind, the constant reminder that her time in this world was finite. Every day she spent with Thomas, every laugh they shared, every lingering touch they exchanged, made it harder to imagine leaving. Yet, she knew in her heart that she could not stay. The ornament, the magic it held, would only work for so long. And when it was time, she would have to return to her own time, leaving him behind. But that moment had not come yet, and so she lingered in this liminal space between two worlds, caught in the midst of a love that was as much a dream as it was reality. Thomas was at his easel, a faint furrow of concentration on his brow as he worked on his latest painting. He hadn't noticed her staring at him, But Evelyn could see the way his shoulders tensed when he worked, the way his hands moved with precision and care, as though the world around him faded away and all that mattered was the canvas before him. She had always admired his dedication, his passion for his craft, even as he struggled against the limitations of his circumstances. But there was something more now. His art had become a reflection of his heart, a heart that had slowly opened to her, despite his initial reservations. Evelyn knew she could never truly explain to him why she had come. She couldn't tell him about the future she had left behind, about the world she came from, because there was no way to make him understand. But in her heart, she knew that their connection was real. She had felt it the moment they met, a bond forged across time and space. And no matter how short their time together was, it was enough. It had to be enough. Evelyn? Thomas's voice cut through her thoughts, and she blinked, pulling her eyes away from the fire to meet his gaze. He was standing now, a paintbrush in hand, his brow furrowed with the same intensity that had been there for the past few hours. But his eyes held a softness now, a tenderness that spoke volumes. "Something on your mind?" he asked, his tone gentle, like he already knew the answer. He could always read her so well, it seemed. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers curling tightly around the fabric of her dress. She knew she had to say something. She could no longer keep her feelings hidden, nor could she continue pretending that everything was fine. But what could she say? She couldn't ask him to follow her into an unknown future, nor could she expect him to wait for her across time. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "about what comes next." Thomas set down his brush, walking toward her with measured steps. The concern in his eyes was palpable, but there was something else there too, an understanding, as if he knew she was carrying a burden that she couldn't easily express. "You've been thinking about leaving, haven't you?" His words hung in the air, a heavy truth neither of them could deny. Evelyn didn't respond immediately, but the weight of his question was enough. She had never been able to hide anything from him, not for long. "I don't want to leave," she said finally, the words escaping her in a rush. "But I know I have to." Thomas knelt beside her, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was tender, but there was a sadness in his eyes, a recognition of the inevitability that neither of them wanted to face. "I don't understand it all, Evelyn," he admitted softly, "but I do understand that you're torn. That this thing between us, this love, is something you can't explain. And maybe I can't either. But that doesn't change how I feel." Evelyn's heart clenched at his words. She had never heard him speak so openly about his emotions. The vulnerability in his voice was raw, unguarded, and it struck her deeper than anything else he had ever said. "But time isn't something we can change," he continued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his eyes. "I don't know how this is possible, but what I do know is that I don't want to lose you." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him that she felt the same, that she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him, even though she knew she had to. But how could she ask him to give up everything, to leave behind everything he knew, just to follow her into a world he couldn't understand? How could she ask him to wait for her, to believe that they could be together forever when she had no idea how it would even work? "I don't want to lose you either," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I don't know how to make this work. I don't know how to make this last." Thomas took her hands in his grip warm and firm. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. All I know is that I want to be with you, Evelyn. I want to share whatever time we have left, no matter how short it is. I want to make every moment count." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, and she didn't bother to hold them back. There was no use pretending anymore, not when the truth felt so raw. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest as his arms wrapped around her, holding her close as though he could shield her from the world. For a moment, There was only the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, and the quiet whisper of the snow falling outside. Time itself seemed to slow, allowing them both to savor the peace of being together, of having this moment. "I don't know what will happen," Evelyn said softly, "but I promise you, Thomas, that I will never forget you. Not ever. You've made my world brighter than I ever thought it could be." He pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes, his gaze steady and full of love. "And I will never forget you, Evelyn. No matter where you go, no matter how far apart we are. You've changed my life." The words hung in the air between them, a promise neither of them could break, even as the inevitability of their separation loomed in the distance. And in that moment, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that their love could transcend time, even if it was only for a little while longer. The clock ticked on, each second bringing them closer to the end of their shared time. But for now, they would cherish the moments they had, living in the warmth of their connection while it lasted. Chapter 11. Threads of Frost, Threads of Hope. The days had begun to blur together, one snow-covered morning following the next, each as beautiful and haunting as the last. The weight of impending separation loomed over Evelyn like a dark cloud, and no matter how much she tried to push it from her mind, it always found its way back, lingering in the quiet spaces between moments with Thomas. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Even the fire in the hearth, which once felt like a constant source of warmth, now felt almost too bright in contrast to the growing chill in Evelyn's heart. She tried not to let it show, tried to smile and laugh as if everything were still normal, but the truth was, she was falling apart inside. Thomas, ever the attentive observer, seemed to sense it. It was as if he could see the weight of her thoughts even when she tried to hide them behind a smile. He had become more watchful these past few days, more silent, as though waiting for the moment when they would have to confront the reality that neither of them wanted to face. But that moment had not yet come. For now, they continued to share their days in quiet companionship, the time they had left together slipping away with every passing second. Evelyn sat at the small wooden table, her hands clasped tightly around the cup of tea in front of her. The steam rose in delicate tendrils, the fragrance of cinnamon and cloves filling the air, but it was all background noise to the storm that raged inside her. She glanced up at Thomas, who was across the room, his hands steady as he worked on his latest painting. The faint glow of the candlelight cast long shadows over his face, and for a brief moment, Evelyn wondered if he could see the same heaviness in her eyes that she saw in his. He set down his brush with a soft sigh, his gaze lifting to meet hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but the silence between them was anything but comfortable. It was the silence of two people who knew that something was coming, something they could neither ignore nor outrun. "You're quiet tonight," Thomas said, his voice gentle but probing, as if he already knew the answer. More so than usual. Evelyn looked at him, her heart aching at the sight of him, the man who had become everything to her in such a short time. How could she explain what was in her heart when even she didn't fully understand it? "I'm just thinking," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Thinking about everything. About us." Thomas stood and walked over to her, his steps soft on the wooden floor. He stopped just beside her, his presence filling the space between them. Without saying a word, he reached out and placed a hand over hers, his touch warm and steady. "We've talked about this before," he said quietly. "I know what you're going through, Evelyn. I feel it too. But we can't keep pretending that this isn't happening." She looked up at him then, her heart in her throat. "I know," she whispered. "I know. But I don't know how to let go of you. I don't know how to walk away from everything we've built together." He knelt beside her, his eyes soft with understanding. but there was a quiet resolve there too. Something in his gaze that made her heart ache with the certainty that he knew what was coming, that he knew the pain they would both have to endure, and yet he was still here, holding her hand like he wouldn't let go, no matter what. "We don't have to let go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet, at least. And when the time comes, we will find a way to hold on, Evelyn. I don't know how, but I will. I'll wait for you if that's what it takes." Tears sprang to Evelyn's eyes, and she couldn't hold them back anymore. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his shoulder, allowing herself to cry, to release the overwhelming grief she had kept locked inside. "I don't want you to wait," she choked out. "I don't want you to suffer because of me." Thomas held her tightly, his hand running gently through her hair. "I will never suffer because of you, Evelyn. The time we've had together has been more than I could have ever imagined, and I would never trade it for anything, not even if I knew from the start that it would end. You've shown me what it means to truly live, to truly love." Evelyn's sobs quieted as she listened to his words, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a small sliver of peace settled over her heart. He was right. The time they had shared was more than she could have asked for, and no matter how painful the end would be, she knew that their love, however fleeting, had been real. "I wish there was a way to make it last," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the tears. "I wish I could stay with you." Thomas pulled back slightly to look at her, his hand cupping her cheek as he gazed into her eyes, as though searching for the words that would ease the ache between them. "I wish that too," he said softly. "But maybe it's not about how long we have. Maybe it's about what we do with the time we're given." His words were simple, but they resonated deep within her, like a bell tolling in the quiet of the night. It wasn't about the years they wouldn't have, or the future they couldn't share. It was about the love they had right now, the love that existed between them in this moment, despite the impossible distance that time had placed between their worlds. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his touch soothe her. She couldn't stop time. She couldn't change the course of events. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to. Maybe love was enough to bridge the gap between their worlds, even if it was only for a short while. "We will always have this," she said, her voice steady now. "No matter what happens, no matter how far apart we are, we will always have this love." Thomas smiled then, a small, bittersweet smile that touched his eyes with a quiet sadness. "Yes," he said softly, "always." And as the snow continued to fall outside, the world around them fading into a peaceful silence, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that maybe their love would endure. Perhaps it would live on in the magic of the ornament, in the memories they had made, in the hearts they had touched. For now, that was enough. And perhaps it would always be enough. Chapter 12. The Ornament That Binds Us. The days had grown shorter, and the chill of winter had settled deeper into the world around them. Each morning, the snowflakes seemed to fall with an added weight, their delicate shapes swirling in the air as if they too understood that time was running out. The quiet days spent in Thomas's cottage had come to feel both like a dream and an impossibility, and Evelyn found herself wishing, at times, that she could simply close her eyes and wake up from it all. But every time she opened them again, Thomas was still there, his presence both comforting and painful as the inevitable approached. Evelyn had tried to prepare herself for the moment when the magic of the ornament would call her back to her own time. She had tried to keep her heart guarded, to remind herself that this love, no matter how real it felt, was nothing more than a fleeting gift. But the longer she stayed, the harder it became to pretend that she wasn't falling deeper into a life she knew she would have to leave behind. It was on a particularly cold evening, as the last vestiges of twilight faded into the long winter night, that Evelyn felt the unmistakable pull of the ornament again. She was sitting by the fire, a woolen shawl draped over her shoulders, staring into the flames as they crackled and popped. Thomas had gone into town to gather supplies, leaving her alone with her thoughts, which seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The ornament, small and unassuming on the mantel, glowed faintly, its presence suddenly far more pronounced than it had been in days. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stood slowly, as though afraid that making any sudden movement might shatter the fragile thread that held her in this time. The ornament shimmered, and for a moment, the room seemed to pulse with a soft, otherworldly glow. Evelyn reached out, her fingers trembling as she took it in her hands. It was warm, warmer than it should have been, and as her fingers brushed its surface, a rush of memories flooded her mind. Visions of the future, of her world, and of the life she had left behind. She closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her. But it was not the future she saw that brought tears to her eyes. It was the face of Thomas, his smile so real, so vivid, as though he were standing right there beside her. She could almost hear his voice, soft and comforting, telling her that everything would be okay, that they would find a way. But that was a lie, wasn't it? They couldn't find a way. Not here, not now. The pull of the ornament grew stronger, the magic more insistent, and she felt a sharp pang in her chest as though something deep inside her was being torn away. She could feel the time slipping away, the world around her beginning to fade as her reality warped and bent under the weight of the enchantment. "No," she whispered to herself, clutching the ornament tightly in her hands as though she could hold onto it forever. "Please, not yet. Not yet." But the magic was relentless. She could feel it pulling her away from everything she had come to love, from the life she had shared with Thomas. The warmth of the fire dimmed. The shadows stretched long across the room, and she knew that this was it. The moment had arrived. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Thomas stepped inside. His face flushed from the cold, his breath visible in the air as he shook the snow from his coat. His eyes flicked to Evelyn, and then to the ornament in her hands. His expression faltered for just a moment, the unspoken understanding passing between them. He knew what was happening. He had known all along. "Evelyn," he began, his voice low, almost as though he were afraid to speak the words aloud. "Is it time?" She didn't need to answer. He saw it in her eyes, in the way she was gripping the ornament as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. He walked toward her, his steps slow and measured, as though he were walking toward something inevitable, something he couldn't change. "I've known this day would come," he said softly, standing beside her now. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, and she felt a shiver run through her at the warmth of his touch. "I've tried not to think about it, tried not to face it, but it's here now, isn't it?" Evelyn nodded, the tears she had been fighting back finally spilling over. She wiped them away quickly, but Thomas was already there, his hand gently cupping her cheek. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even sad, not in the way she expected. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance in his eyes, an understanding that they both had to let go, even though neither of them wanted to. "You don't have to say goodbye," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Not yet. We'll make the most of the time we have left. I'll make sure of it." Evelyn's heart broke at his words. He was offering her a final gift, one that she knew she could never truly accept. He wanted to hold on. He wanted to make every moment count, to live in the now. But how could she ask him to do that when she knew she would be torn from him so soon? "I wish," she began, her voice faltering, but she couldn't finish. She didn't need to. They both knew what she wished for. To stay, to never leave. But wishes, no matter how deeply felt, couldn't change the course of time. Thomas leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You'll always be with me," he said softly. "In my heart, in my art, in every stroke of the brush. "You'll never be truly gone." The words, though comforting, felt like a final farewell. Evelyn closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his love wrap around her like a protective shield. If she had to leave, if she had to return to her own time, at least she would carry this moment with her forever. She placed the ornament gently on the mantel, her fingers lingering on its surface for a moment longer. Then she turned to face Thomas, the man she had come to love more than anything, and she took his hands in hers. "I will never forget you," she whispered. "No matter where I go, no matter how far apart we are, you will always be a part of me. Always." For a long moment, they stood together, not saying anything, just existing in the quiet, knowing that whatever happened next, whatever the future held, they had shared something beautiful, something beyond time. And then, with one final, lingering kiss, the world around Evelyn began to blur. The room faded, the cottage slipping away as she was pulled into the magic of the ornament once more, her heart heavy with love and loss. Chapter 13. Shadows of the Future, Ghosts of the Past. The world around her spun in a dizzying blur of colors and sounds, the familiar warmth of Thomas's cottage fading into the distance as the magic of the ornament took hold. Evelyn clutched it tightly in her hands, desperate to hold onto the last trace of the life she had left behind. But the pull of time was too strong, too relentless. She could feel herself slipping away, her body floating, as though it had lost all sense of gravity. And in the haze of it all, she couldn't help but wonder, was she leaving a part of herself behind in this time? Or was she carrying it with her, in some way she couldn't yet understand? As the sensation of being pulled through time intensified, Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the growing panic in her chest. She didn't know how long it lasted, minutes, hours, days. But when the world finally settled around her, the familiar stillness of the present moment greeted her. The soft hum of life, the sound of distant traffic, the faint aroma of cinnamon from the bakery down the street. It all flooded her senses in a way that was both comforting and heartbreaking. She was back. She was home. But as her feet touched solid ground once more, Evelyn felt an emptiness inside her, a void that had not been there before. It was as though a piece of her heart had stayed behind in the past, tethered to a time she could never return to. She took a shaky breath, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. She was no longer in Thomas's world. She was no longer by his side. For a long moment, she stood there, unmoving, the weight of the ornament in her hand the only thing that anchored her to the present. It was a fragile thing, the small glass orb gleaming in the weak winter sunlight. It was the only connection she had left to him, the only thing that remained of the love that had crossed the boundaries of time itself. But even as she looked at it, she could feel the distance growing between them, the gulf that could not be bridged. She was back in her own world, surrounded by the mundane, by the noise of the present, and it felt like a cruel, cold reminder that the magic she had experienced was now gone. She had come so close to a life she could have cherished, a life with Thomas. But now, she had to face the reality of her own existence, the life that continued without him. With a deep breath, Evelyn stepped forward, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence of the street. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to move, needed to do something to fill the emptiness that had settled in her chest. She couldn't stay there. Not yet. Not in that moment of raw grief and longing. There had to be something to hold on to. There had to be a way to move forward. The familiar sights of her city greeted her as she walked, the streets bustling with the usual holiday energy. People were wrapped in scarves and coats, their faces flushed from the cold, their voices filled with the cheer of the season. Yet, to Evelyn, everything seemed muted, distant. It was as if the life she had left behind in Victorian England was a dream, a a fantasy, a thing she could never truly touch again. As she wandered, her thoughts kept drifting back to Thomas, his smile, his laugh, the way he had held her in his arms, as though he could protect her from the world. He had given her everything, and she had taken it, knowing that it was fleeting, knowing that she could never stay. She found herself standing in front of a small art gallery, one she had visited many times before. But today, as she gazed at the familiar display of paintings in the window, it felt different. The colors were brighter, the brushstrokes more vivid. She had always admired art, but now, it was as though she saw it with new eyes. She saw the beauty in the details, the way a piece of canvas could hold an entire world within it, the way a single stroke could evoke so much emotion. And for the first time since returning, Evelyn understood why Thomas had dedicated his life to painting. He had captured the world in a way she could never fully comprehend, but now she saw it. She saw the way he had painted their love, the way he had captured the moments they shared in his art, immortalizing them on the canvas for eternity. She could still feel the warmth of his touch, the gentleness of his voice, and the way he had looked at her with such tenderness. In those paintings, she saw a love that could never be forgotten. The thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. She had to find his work. She had to find him. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't let the love they had shared be lost to time. With newfound purpose, Evelyn turned away from the gallery and headed toward the nearest bookstore. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to find something, anything, that could connect her to him once more. Maybe there was a clue hidden in the pages of a book, some small trace of his art, something that could lead her to him. The bookstore was quiet, the smell of paper and ink filling the air as she walked through the aisles, searching for something familiar. And then, in the back corner of the store, she saw it, a small, dusty volume of art history, its cover faded with age. She pulled it from the shelf, her hands trembling as she opened it to the section on Victorian painters. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the pages, her eyes frantically searching for any mention of his name. And then she saw it. There, in the margins of a page, was a small sketch of a woman with long, dark hair and a soft, wistful smile. It was a sketch of her. The lines were delicate, but there was no mistaking the image. It was Thomas's work. He had painted her. He had captured her likeness, immortalized her in his art. And in that moment, Evelyn knew. He had never forgotten her. He had carried her with him, just as she had carried him with her. Tears filled her eyes as she closed the book, holding it tightly against her chest. He had left her a gift, a reminder that their love had been real, a love that had transcended time, a love that would never be erased. Evelyn stepped out of the bookstore and into the street, the cold air stinging her face, but she didn't care. She felt alive again, as though something inside her had shifted. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that store. She was someone who had been loved, someone whose heart would always belong to a man from a time she could never return to. But even so, she carried him with her in every heartbeat, in every breath. And as she stood there, the lights of the city twinkling around her like stars in the night sky, Evelyn knew that their love, no matter how brief, would always be a part of her. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift of all. Chapter 14. When Love Defies the Hourglass. The weeks passed in a blur of gray skies and cold winds, and though the holiday season continued to hum with its usual cheer, Evelyn found herself drifting through it as though she were walking in someone else's world. The days felt like shadows, slipping away before she could grasp them, and she had learned to live with the heavy ache that settled in her chest, the empty space left by the love she had lost. No matter how much she tried to bury it, there was always something that pulled her back to Thomas, back to the world she had once belonged to. Christmas was approaching, and though it had always been a time of joy, of family and warmth, This year it was different. Evelyn walked the city streets, her breath misting in the cold air, her eyes drawn to the decorations hanging on every corner, the festive lights twinkling like distant stars. But none of it could bring the magic she had once felt, the magic of the Christmas Eve that had changed everything. The ornaments, the cold night air, and most of all, Thomas. The man she had loved, the man she had left behind. It had been weeks since she had returned to her own time, and she still hadn't found what she was looking for. The sketch she had discovered in the art book had given her a glimpse of hope, but it was fleeting. She hadn't found any mention of Thomas in the art world. No trace of the man who had painted her, who had captured her soul in his work. She had scoured every book, visited every gallery, but nothing had led her to him. It was as though he had vanished from history, as though the love they had shared was destined to be lost to time. But even so, Evelyn refused to give up. She knew that the connection they had shared was too real to be erased, too powerful to simply fade into nothing. And so, she continued her search, driven by the belief that there was something, some thread of fate that would guide her back to him. One chilly afternoon, as she wandered through the familiar streets of the city, Evelyn found herself drawn to a small, tucked-away gallery she had never noticed before. The door was slightly ajar, and the sign above read, "Whispers of the Past." An art exhibition? Curiosity piqued, Evelyn pushed the door open and stepped inside. The gallery was quiet, the walls lined with paintings, some new, some old, all bursting with color and emotion. But it wasn't the paintings that caught her attention. It was the atmosphere, the feeling that seemed to hang in the air, as if the past itself were whispering from every corner. The gallery was small, intimate, and there, in the farthest corner, was an easel, upon which stood a painting that made her heart stop. It was Thomas's work. She knew it instantly, even without seeing his name. The brushstrokes were bold, but delicate, capturing the light in a way that seemed almost magical. The subject was a woman, with dark hair and a soft, wistful expression, standing in a winter garden surrounded by snow. The painting was so lifelike, so intimate, that it felt as though the woman could step right out of the frame. And as Evelyn stared at it, her pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. It was her. The painting was of her. In that moment when she had stood beside the fire in Thomas's cottage, the glow of the flames casting shadows on her face, the world outside a blanket of snow. She remembered the feeling of that night as if it were yesterday, the warmth of his touch, the way he had looked at her with such tenderness. And here it was, captured in paint, immortalized forever. But there was something else about the painting, something that tugged at her heart. In the corner, just below the signature, was a date. Christmas Eve, 1884. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. It was the night she had left, the night she had returned to her own time. It couldn't be a coincidence. This painting, this beautiful piece of art, had been created after she had gone, after she had left him behind. Her mind raced, her thoughts colliding in a whirlwind of confusion and hope. How could this be? How had Thomas known to paint her, to capture her likeness when she was no longer there? Was this painting a sign that their love had left an imprint on time, that their connection was not confined to the boundaries of their worlds? As she stood there, lost in the wonder of the painting, a voice broke through her thoughts. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Evelyn turned, startled to see an older man standing nearby. He was wearing a thick scarf, his eyes bright with the knowledge of someone who had seen many things in his time. He smiled gently as he looked at the painting. "It's one of my favorite pieces in the collection. I've always thought there was something magical about it." "Who painted it?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile deepened. "Ah, that's an interesting story. The artist's name was Thomas Hale. He was a talented painter, but his work was never widely known. He was a bit of a mystery, you see. His paintings were often so personal, so intimate, that he rarely showed them to anyone. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Thomas Hale. It was him. It had to be. Do you know when this one was painted? She asked, her voice trembling. Ah, this one, the man said, looking fondly at the painting. This was his final piece, painted just before he passed away. He finished it on Christmas Eve, 1884. He said it was his way of immortalizing a love he would never forget. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. A love he would never forget? The man nodded. Yes, you see, Thomas had a special muse. A woman he loved deeply. But she was from another time, you see. He never fully understood how or why, but he painted her, again and again. And this painting, this last one, was his tribute to her. He said she had gone, but her spirit remained with him. It was a love that transcended time, he said. Evelyn stood frozen, her mind reeling with the impossible truth. The woman in the painting, the love Thomas had immortalized. It was her. He had painted her. He had painted their love. The man seemed to sense her shock and smiled softly. Some loves, my dear, never truly leave us. They linger, like echoes in the wind, and sometimes they find a way to be remembered. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes as she gazed at the painting. It wasn't just a painting. It was proof. Proof that the love she had shared with Thomas had left a mark that could never be erased, no matter how many years passed. She turned to the man, her voice barely a whisper. Where can I find more of his work? The man looked at her with a knowing smile. If you're searching for more, my dear, you'll find them scattered throughout the city. But remember, sometimes the most beautiful things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person to notice them. Evelyn nodded, her heart racing with a mixture of grief and hope. She had found him. She had found a piece of him in this world, and though the future was uncertain, she knew one thing for certain. Their love would never fade. It would live on in every stroke of the brush, in every piece of art that captured the essence of who they had been together. And as she left the gallery, her heart full of both sorrow and joy, Evelyn knew that no matter where she went, Thomas would always be with her. In the art, in the memories, in the very air she breathed. Their love, though separated by time, had left its mark, an indelible echo that would never fade. Chapter 15. The Final Stroke of Midnight. Evelyn couldn't remember the last time she had felt this alive. The discovery of Thomas's final painting had breathed new life into her, filling the void that had haunted her since her return. She had spent days, weeks even, walking through the streets of the city, searching for a sign, for a trace of him, and now she had found it. In the brushstrokes, in the colors, in the soft contours of her face. Thomas had left a piece of himself behind, a testament to a love that had transcended time itself. But as she gazed at the painting again, her heart heavy with the weight of what it represented, she couldn't shake the lingering sadness. The love they had shared was real. She could feel it in every fiber of her being. But it was also impossible. It was a love that could never be, not in the way she had hoped. The world she had returned to was her own, and Thomas, as much as she longed for him, remained a figure of the past. The thought gnawed at her, the knowledge that no matter how much she wished for it, no matter how hard she tried to hold on to the love they had shared, it was not meant to be. She couldn't stay in the past forever. She couldn't abandon the life she had built. The ache in her chest was constant, a reminder of the impossibility of it all. Still, Evelyn refused to let go of the memory of Thomas. She refused to let their love fade into nothing. She carried it with her in every breath, in every heartbeat. It was her secret, her own quiet rebellion against the reality of time. And though the world around her moved forward, she would always carry a piece of him, tucked away in the depths of her soul. It was a quiet evening, just days before Christmas, when Evelyn found herself standing in front of a small, old bookstore. She had passed by it countless times, but had never stopped in. There was something about it tonight, though, that pulled her in. She felt an inexplicable pull, as if the store itself were calling to her. She pushed open the door, the bell above it chiming softly as she entered. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of aged paper, and the dim light cast shadows on the shelves, creating an atmosphere that felt both familiar and strange. The store seemed to be lost in time, the shelves crammed with books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. Yet, as Evelyn wandered through the aisles, her fingers grazing the spines of old novels, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It was a place where time didn't seem to matter, a sanctuary for lost things. Her eyes were drawn to a section in the back, filled with old journals and manuscripts. She was about to move closer when something caught her eye, a small, leather-bound book, half hidden on a dusty shelf. The cover was plain, unmarked, but there was something about it that drew her in. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the rough leather, and as she opened it, her breath caught. The pages were filled with delicate, handwritten notes, sketches, and paintings. The ink was faded, the edges of the pages curled with age. And in the center of the book, on a page that was more worn than the rest, was a portrait of her. It was unmistakable. The same dark hair, the same wistful expression. It was a portrait of her, painted by Thomas. But there was something different about it this time. This wasn't the portrait from the gallery. This was something more intimate, more raw. The brushstrokes were rougher, less polished, but they captured the essence of her in a way that no painting ever could. Evelyn's heart raced as she turned the page. There, alongside the portrait, was a note in Thomas's handwriting. "To my dearest Evelyn, this is the woman who stole my heart. You are the warmth in the coldest winter, the light in the darkest night. I will love you, always, though time may separate us. I will carry you in my soul, forever." The words hit her like a tidal wave. She could feel the depth of his love, the raw emotion behind each stroke of the pen. This was real. This wasn't just art. This was a love letter, written across time. He had left this behind for her, for the woman who had stolen his heart. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the weight of the moment settled over her. She had always known, deep down, that Thomas's love for her had been more than just fleeting. But this letter, this confession, it was the proof she had needed. He had never forgotten her. He had never let go. But even as the warmth of his words surrounded her, a part of her hesitated. She could feel the pull of her own life, the life she had built in the present. She couldn't simply throw it all away. She had responsibilities, dreams, and people who depended on her. Could she really leave it all behind for a love that existed only in the pages of a book, in the strokes of a painting? Was it enough to live for a memory, for a love that had already passed? The questions lingered in her mind as she closed the book, her hands trembling. She had found something more than she had ever hoped for, but it only made her feel more lost. The love she had with Thomas was real, but the life she had built in this world was real too. She couldn't deny either of them. She was torn between two worlds, two loves, each one pulling her in a different direction. The weight of time pressed on her, heavy and unrelenting. There was no easy answer. She couldn't go back to the past, but she couldn't let go of the love that had changed her, that had shaped her. She had to find a way to reconcile the two parts of herself, the woman who had loved Thomas across time, and the woman who had to live in the present. With a deep, steadying breath, Evelyn tucked the book into her bag and left the bookstore. The cold air outside seemed sharper now, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she would never forget Thomas. She would never forget the love they had shared, and she would carry it with her, always. The world around her continued on, the Christmas lights twinkling in the distance, but for Evelyn, the moment felt suspended in time. And for the first time since her return, she felt as though she were standing at the edge of something new, something unknown, but something that held the promise of both sorrow and hope. Chapter 16. A Bridge Woven of Starlight. Evelyn stood at the edge of the city, the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots the only sound in the stillness. Christmas Eve had arrived once more, a night that felt both distant and painfully close. The holiday lights twinkled in the distance, casting a soft glow over the city streets, but for Evelyn, the world around her seemed to fade into the background. Her mind was filled with the weight of her discoveries, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her love for Thomas would forever remain a distant memory, one confined to a time she could no longer reach. The book she had found in the bookstore sat in her bag, a constant reminder of the love that had shaped her, that had filled her with a sense of purpose and passion she had never known. And yet, despite the undeniable connection she felt to the past, the life she had built in the present called to her with a voice she could not ignore. She had spent the past days in a quiet haze, caught between two worlds, the one she had left behind and the one she had returned to. Her job, her friends, the life she had built here. All of it seemed so fragile now, as if it were on the verge of slipping away. But how could she leave it behind? How could she abandon the life that had become her own? It wasn't just about the people in her life. It was about the person she had become. She had changed during her time with Thomas. She had seen the world in a new light, had experienced a love so deep, so pure, that it had redefined everything she thought she knew about herself. And now, here she was, standing at the crossroads of her own life, faced with a choice that would determine her future. Could she continue to live in the present, with the memory of Thomas as a bittersweet echo in her heart? Or would she take a leap of faith, risking everything to return to the past, to the love she had left behind? As if in answer to her silent questioning, the wind picked up, carrying with it a familiar scent, the faint, sweet fragrance of pine and winter air. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her. It was the scent of Christmas Eve, the scent of the night she had first met Thomas, the night everything had changed. A soft whisper stirred in her mind, a memory of the moment when she had first held the magical ornament, the moment she had been transported back to Victorian England. The ornament had been a gift, a connection between her and Thomas, a symbol of their love across time. But now, as she stood in the present, that connection seemed both tangible and impossible, as if she were caught between two worlds, neither of which she truly belonged to. Her thoughts drifted to the night she had left, the night she had returned to the present. She remembered the pain in Thomas's eyes, the heartbreak that had lingered in the air between them as she had walked away. It had been the hardest thing she had ever done, and yet she had known, deep down, that it was the right thing. She had believed that she could never truly belong in his world, that their love was a beautiful dream, but one that couldn't withstand the realities of time. But now, standing in the cold night air, she wondered if she had been wrong. Could it be that their love was stronger than time itself? Could it be that their connection had left a mark on both their worlds, that no matter how far apart they were, they would always be bound together? Evelyn reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the leather cover of the book. She pulled it out, her hands trembling slightly as she opened to the page with Thomas's note. His words still echoed in her mind, a declaration of love that had never truly faded. I will love you, always, though time may separate us. I will carry you in my soul, forever. The tears welled up again, but this time, they were not filled with sorrow. They were filled with a quiet understanding, a recognition that the love they had shared could never be undone. It was a love that had transcended time, a love that had left an imprint on her heart, one that would remain, no matter what path she chose. The question now was no longer about whether she could return to the past. It was about whether she could find the courage to follow her heart, to take the risk of returning to Thomas, knowing that it meant leaving everything she had in this world behind. The world around her seemed to fade as she stood there, the weight of her decision pressing on her shoulders. Time was a fragile thing, a force that could not be tamed. But love, true love, was even more fragile, and yet, it was also the strongest force of all. It was a force that could defy time, that could bridge the gap between worlds. Evelyn knew what she had to do. She couldn't live in two worlds, torn between the love she had lost and the life she had built. She couldn't continue to carry the weight of both, hoping that time would somehow heal the wounds of the past. With a deep breath, she turned toward the familiar glow of the Christmas lights in the distance. She had made her choice. She had chosen love, and no matter what the future held, she would never regret it. Her heart raced as she walked toward the city square, the sound of the crowd filling her ears. But amidst the noise, there was a stillness inside her, a certainty that she had made the right choice. She had found the courage to let go, to trust in the love she had shared with Thomas. And as she reached the heart of the square, she knew that whatever happened next, whatever journey awaited her, she would not face it alone. The ornament, the key to everything, was still in her possession. It had brought her to Thomas once before, and it would do so again. She didn't know what lay beyond the next moment, but she was ready. Ready to risk everything for the chance to be with him again. Ready to return to the world where love was timeless, where the impossible was possible. And so, with one final glance at the world she had known, Evelyn closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for the strength to take the leap. And in that moment, she felt it, a soft pull, a warmth that seemed to rise from the very core of her being. It was the pull of time, the pull of love calling her back. With a sense of peace settling over her, Evelyn let herself go. Chapter 17. Eternal December. The world around Evelyn blurred as she stood in the heart of the city square, her heart pounding in her chest. The Christmas lights glittered like stars, twinkling above the bustling crowd, but they felt distant, as if the noise and movement of the world no longer held any meaning for her. She was no longer tethered to this time, no longer bound by the rules of the present. She had made her choice. The ornament rested in the palm of her hand, warm against her skin. The same ornament that had been her connection to Thomas, the one thing that had allowed their love to survive the ravages of time. It had brought her here, to this moment, to this crossroads between two worlds. She had chosen to return to him. Evelyn closed her eyes and held the ornament tightly, focusing on the warmth that seemed to radiate from it. She could feel its power, the pull of the past drawing her in, the love that had once bound her and Thomas together. She thought of him, the way his eyes had looked at her, the way his touch had made her feel like she was the only person in the world. She remembered the first time she had met him, the way his presence had filled the room with warmth and light. She remembered the long, cold walks through the snow, the quiet conversations that had turned into hours of laughter, the way they had shared their hopes and dreams as if they were already intertwined. She thought of the love they had shared, a love that had transcended time, that had survived despite the impossible distance between them. A soft breeze stirred the air around her, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and winter. It was the same scent that had filled the air the night she had first traveled back in time, the night she had met Thomas. She opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat as the world around her began to fade. The lights of the city flickered once, then twice, before dissolving into a blur of color. The cold wind that had brushed against her face was replaced by the familiar chill of a Victorian winter. The bustling city streets were gone, replaced by the cobbled lanes and gas lamps of a time long past. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she realized what had happened. She was back. She stood in the middle of a quiet street, surrounded by the low hum of the night. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, the distant clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestone roads. And then, through the mist that hung in the air, she saw him. Thomas. He stood at the far end of the street, his figure illuminated by the soft glow of a gas lamp. He was looking down at something in his hands, but as if sensing her presence, he looked up. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to vanish. There was no crowd, no noise, only the two of them, standing across time, their souls still bound together by the invisible thread of love. Evelyn felt a surge of emotion, a wave of relief and joy that washed over her, threatening to overwhelm her. He was here. He was real. She had come back to him. Without a second thought, she began to walk toward him, her footsteps quickening with every passing moment. The distance between them seemed to close in an instant, and before she knew it, she was standing in front of him, her breath coming in soft, ragged gasps. Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before his lips parted in disbelief. "Evelyn?" His voice was a hushed whisper, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Is it truly you?" Evelyn nodded, tears springing to her eyes as she reached for him. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I'm here," she whispered. "I've come back to you." He took a step forward, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch her face. "But how? How is this possible?" Evelyn smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with emotion. "It's the ornament," she said, her voice thick with the weight of their shared history. "It's always been the ornament. It brought me back to you." Thomas's eyes widened as he stared at her, a look of awe on his face. "I thought I had lost you forever," he whispered, his voice full of wonder and longing. "I thought you were a dream, a memory that would fade with time." Evelyn shook her head, her fingers brushing against his cheek as she stepped closer to him. "No," she said softly. "I'm real. I'm here, Thomas, and I will always be with you." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of everything they had endured settling over them. The years apart, the pain of their separation, it all seemed to melt away in the warmth of their reunion. There was no more doubt, no more questioning. They had found their way back to each other. Thomas's hands gently cupped her face, and he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was tender and filled with the promise of everything they had lost and everything they would now find together. It was a kiss that sealed their love, a love that had withstood time, distance, and the trials of fate. As they pulled away, Thomas's forehead rested against hers, and he whispered, "I've waited for you. I've always waited for you, Evelyn." Tears slipped down Evelyn's cheeks as she smiled, the joy in her heart overflowing. "And I've come back to you. I'll never leave you again." In that moment, surrounded by the quiet of the Victorian street, with the soft glow of the gas lamps flickering around them, they knew that no matter the trials they would face, no matter what time would bring, they would face it together. They had found their way back to each other, and nothing could ever tear them apart again.